Chapter 18. Ruskin stared down the length of Lizard Street. One by one, the lights in windows, what windows were still unsmashed by Alvis's ball, went out, and people went to bed. Ruskin knew the street so well. He looked at Mr. Lacey's house with his window box full of marigolds. He looked at Dr. Flower's house from where came the sound of the tissue, tissue, tissue. He looked at Sparky Walnut's house, where no doubt Mrs. Walnut hoped his shop window would not be broken again by sleepwalking Alvis. He looked at Corky's house, where Corky would be tucked up in bed, protecting himself from Krindlekrax. He looked at the pub where Mr. and Mrs. Cave smoked endless cigars, and Alvis lay in bed, his ball cradled in his arms. And he looked at the school at the other end of the street, the school with its turrets and railings like a gigantic castle. Ruskin took the medal from his pocket. There was a pin attached to the medal so it could be pinned on the owner. The medal gleamed in the moonlight. The light reflected in Ruskin's eyes and made him feel tired. Ruskin closed his eyes for a while. He must have fallen asleep because suddenly he heard a noise and jumped up. At first he thought it was the Krindlekrax, then he realised it wasn't. Burboing, doboing went the noise. It was Alvis's football. Ruskin peered down Lizard Street. There at the other end, Alvis was sleepwalking and bouncing the ball. Even though Alvis was in his pyjamas, he still wore his American football helmet, and the shoulders to his pyjamas were padded. Here he is. Here's Alvis. There's his ball. The moonlight made Alvis's shadow very long. It ran down the whole length of Lizard Street. Doboing went the ball. It was the only sound in Lizard Street, and it echoed from building to building. What a nasty boy you are, thought Ruskin, watching Alvis. You grew 3 times as big and steal my ball, and you smash all our windows. Suddenly the ball struck a bump in the road and bounced off at an angle. The ball hit Mr. Lacey's window. Smash went the window. One by one the windows of Lizard Street lit up as people struggled out of bed. The first on the street was Mr. Lace. Although he was wearing a long white nightshirt, he still had a scarf round his neck and pencils in his hair. "My window!" cried Mr. Lace, waving his hands in the air. Then he looked at the window boxes. A few of the marigolds had been damaged by the ball. "My flowers!" cried Mr. Lace. "My beautiful flowers!" Other people were in the street now. Mr. Flick in his emerald green dressing gown with a velvet collar, Mrs. Walnut in her olive green potato-smelling dressing gown, Mr. and Mrs. Cave, Dr. Flowers with paper handkerchiefs tucked to his face. They all stood round Mr. Lace and tried to comfort him. "It's terrible," said Mr. Flick. "Outrageous," said Mrs. Walnut. "Disgraceful," said Dr. Flowers. "Tissue?" "You're lucky," Mrs. Walnut said. "He's broken my ship window 6 times now." "And my window 7 times," said Mr. Flick. Ruskin's mum and dad were peering from behind their front door. He keeps breaking our windows too," called Wendy. "Shh," said Winston, closing the door. "Don't interfere." Mr. Cave put his arm around Alvis and said, "Look how innocent he is. He doesn't even know what he's doing. My poor little Alvy baby." Everyone in the street stared at Alvis. "Now then," Mr. Cave said, "give him his ball back. Otherwise he'll be upset in the morning, and you won't want that to happen. You know how many windows Alvis smashes when he gets upset." Mr. Lace bit a pencil off and went inside to get Alvis's ball. "It's terrible," sighed Mr. Flick. "Outrageous," gasped Mrs. Walnut. "Disgraceful," exclaimed Dr. Flowers' tissue. Mr. Lace returned with the ball and gave it to Alvis. As soon as it was in Alvis's hand, he started to bounce it again. Da-boing, da-boing. Mr. and Mrs. Cave led Alvis back to the pub and locked the door. The people of Lizard Street just looked at each other in silence. They all shrugged their shoulders, sighed and went to bed, all except Mr. Lace. He got a broom and started sweeping the broken glass. Corky came out of his house and helped Mr. Lace sweep the glass into a tiny bag. "He's a nuisance, that boy," Mr. Lace said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Even in his sleep he scares us," said Corky. Once all the glass was swept away, Mr. Lace went into his house and locked the door. Corky stood alone in the street for a while. He glanced up and saw Ruskin sitting in his window. Corky waved his stick in the air. Ruskin waved back. Corky went inside and locked his door. Ruskin sat for a while waiting for Krindlekrax, but gradually weariness overcame him and he knew he had to go to bed. He changed into his pyjamas, green, white and striped, looked at the golden medal, then closed the window. "Good night, Lizard Street," he said. "Good night."